During development of Kingdom Hearts, director Tetsuya Nomura had the idea for a spin-off title that featured characters from the franchise fighting each other. The concept would be inappropriate for Disney characters, but Organization 13 could work, as they all had unique weapons and elemental attributes that could be used to give them distinct fighting styles. These plans manifested in 358 over 2 days and its multiplayer mode, but Nomura still wanted a game where characters fought each other in large 3D arenas. He shifted his focus from the organization to Final Fantasy, as the franchise's 20th anniversary was in 2007, and such a project would be a perfect tie-in to that celebratory milestone. As it happened, Nomura was soon approached by younger members of Square Enix's development staff, who wanted to do a game with him as director. He offered them this side project he had been considering, on the condition that he would only act as a producer and advisor, as he wanted the younger members to experience what it was like to oversee a project. In an interview published in the game's Ultimania guide, Nomura was asked if the weight of 20 years of Final Fantasy history was a heavy responsibility for the younger staff. He answered, "At first it didn't really seem to click with them, but when we started making it, they seemed to get that they had been given something very big." On December 18, 2008, 21 years to the day since the original Final Fantasy had been released in Japan, Square Enix released Dissidia Final Fantasy, the game that transformed the franchise. Dissidia had an uphill battle out of the starting gate. For one thing, it was a fighting game, and up to this point when fans heard the words Final Fantasy fighting game, they thought of this. There was skepticism behind the scenes as well. Nomura was concerned about how the fanbase would respond to the idea of a Final Fantasy fighter. The reaction would eventually grow to a boiling boil, thanks in no small part to the advertising. Whoever was in charge of marketing for Dissidia knew exactly what fans wanted to see, and how to maximize their excitement when they finally got it. The first characters revealed for the game in a teaser trailer were the Warrior of Light, Garland, Zidane, and Kuja, with an FMV showing Sephiroth at the end. We then got the first proper trailer with the additions of Squall and Ultimecia, and Firion and the Emperor. Over time came the representatives for Final Fantasy 3, 10, 4, and then 5. Of course, 6 and 7 were revealed last. Specifically, it was Terra and Cloud who were revealed last, as Kefka and Sephiroth had already been in earlier trailers. Releasing content like this felt like a countdown, which made each new reveal more impactful, the game creeping ever closer to release and slowly revealing its full scope with each step. Shantaro and Gabranth were kept secret and revealed later in development, so fans expected 20 characters, one hero and one villain, from each of the first 10 games of the series. There was a lot of discussion in the fanbase about which characters would serve as each game's representative. There was speculation that the reason they had shown Sephiroth in trailers, but not Cloud, was because the 7 representative was going to be Zack. That can seem ridiculous looking back now, the idea that Zack could supplant Cloud. But consider that at the time, it was widely assumed that the villain representatives for Final Fantasy 3 and 10 would be Xand and Seymour, since they were considered the foremost antagonists of those games. But then it turned out that the Cloud of Darkness and Jecht had been chosen. Jecht was particularly surprising as many fans didn't even consider him a villain. There was precedent for the developers blindsiding the fanbase with unexpected choices, and Crisis Core had released the year before, on the same console as Dissidia even, and had been a big hit, so the idea of Zack being chosen over Cloud didn't seem entirely implausible. In another show of the marketing team's cleverness, this mystery was intended. Early trailers edited this FMV to remove Cecil standing behind Squall, and also removed the distinct silhouette of the Buster Sword in Cloud's hand in this shot. This scene of the villains didn't remove Exdeath, Kefka, and Sephiroth from the far shots, but they did cut out the close-ups of them that the scene includes in the final game. The result was that the trailers technically showed most of the characters, it just obscured their identities, and the fanbase dissected these trailers like detectives, looking for clues to figure out who was who. Some even claim that this moment, where Sephiroth raises his sword to fight an unseen opponent, showed a quick freeze frame of Cloud or Zack, and as it turns out, it does. The official reveals of the cast came in the form of monthly magazine articles. First a single page with their artwork and a few screenshots, and a week later there would be a multi-page article that covered them in detail, and also provided more general information about the game, like how EX mode worked, what the story mode would be like, alternate costumes, etc. While each trailer included all characters that had been revealed up to that point, They gave extra time to the characters that had been revealed since the previous trailer, and somewhere along the way doing this, the official website would be updated with their profiles, giving us a better look at their official artwork and screenshots of their gameplay. With every character reveal, Dissidia teased fans with just enough to get them interested, and left them eager to see more later, a continuous loop of marketing hype. Rounding out the roster were the gods the summoned warriors fought for, Cosmos and Chaos, the gods of harmony and discord. The two didn't appear until the second-to-last trailer that included all 20 main characters for the first time, and Cosmos was shown telling the heroes about the crystals they needed to gather. Chaos was revealed in the trailer's closing moments, sitting on his throne with his claws clasped, just like in Yoshitaka Amano's concept art from 20 years ago. The music went low, the camera zoomed in, and his name faded into view, inviting players to soak in the importance of his presence. The developers all but directly told players that this was the final boss that would be waiting for them when the game came out, and he would not go down lightly. The game's launch was a solid success. It sold over 900,000 copies in Japan in the first few months of its release, and had total lifetime global sales of 1.8 million. For comparison, around the same time frame, Crisis Core sold just over 3 million copies, Final Fantasy XII sold just over 5 million, Kingdom Hearts 2 sold 4 million, and Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep sold 1.7 million. With such reception, it was inevitable that Square Enix would capitalize on Dissidia's momentum. A few years later came Dissidia Duodecim, a prequel that was also a sort of final mix type rework of the original game, with lots of new content including new characters. This time there were no guidelines on who would get in, which meant anyone could get in, and the first trailer proved that by showing Lightning, Kain, and Tifa. They would be joined by Vaughn, Laguna, Yuna, Prish, Gilgamesh, and Feral Chaos, a deranged form of the original Chaos. While there were fewer new additions, the trailers also showed off new attacks, new costumes, new arenas, and new gameplay mechanics. They also teased a new, more complex storyline. Since this was a prequel, it begged the question of what had happened to the characters that they weren't in the first game, and the trailers showed the heroes facing doubt, deceit, and treachery. This was emphasized by an extended version of the original game's theme that segged into a more foreboding second phase, as characters turned their weapons against their comrades with accusations of betrayal. Dissidia Duodecim was not as successful as the first game, but still did well. It should be noted that the PSP was well known for vulnerability to hacking. By some reports, the original Dissidia was one of the most pirated PSP games ever, with over 5 million illegal downloads. But for Dissidia Duodecim, hacking wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The game's DLC files are stored on the PSP's hard drive, and hackers figured out how to take a 3D model from another source, replace a Dissidia character's model with it, and then that model could be used in-game as a costume. Naturally, the first model hacks were Kingdom Hearts characters and other Final Fantasy characters, but hackers could use anyone they wanted from any franchise. Dissidia became the means by which players could create the fantasy matchups of their dreams. If they had a 3D model, they could be made playable, and if they didn't, determined creators would make one, as evidenced by playable Noctis mods years before Versus 13 was rebranded. The game's hacking community thrived for years after release, and while membership has shrunk, there are still many Dissidia modders out there, some of which go much further than just character swaps. Dissidia spawned a rhythm game spin-off title, Theatrhythm, which became its own series, and several years later came an arcade sequel that was ported to the PlayStation 4 as Dissidia NT. Dissidia NT got a more chilly reception due to changes from the PSP games, including a lack of single-player content, removal of many customization options, and a focus on team-based 3-on-3 multiplayer. Square Enix had planned to support it for at least 5 years with an eventual roster of 50 characters, but fan interest dwindled and NT shifted to a free-to-play model, before active development ended in March of 2020. At this time, 2 years after its home console release, the game boasted a final roster of 38 characters, slightly higher than Dissidia Duodecim's roster of 31. However, what the PSP games accomplished stretches far beyond sales numbers and spin-offs. They rewrote the rules on what Final Fantasy was as a franchise, and laid the foundations for what it was going to become. Let's travel back in time to 2006. Over the last 2 years, the franchise has seen the release of Final Fantasy XII, the DS remake of Final Fantasy III, and Game Boy Advance ports of the 5 Nintendo-era titles besides 3. 2007 will see the release of the 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV, and the PSP ports of Final Fantasy I and II. Final Fantasy XIII and its expanded universe, at least the one intended at the time with Agito and Versus 13, were revealed earlier this year, and Final Fantasy XIII will be released in 2009. In the wake of this barrage of remakes and the reveal of the next major multi-game project, Dissidia will be released in 2008. But for now in 2006, ask a random Final Fantasy fan a question. Who is Firion? If you hadn't played Final Fantasy II, you likely only had a vague awareness about Firion besides him being the main protagonist of that title. But even if you had played the game, there wasn't all that much more to say about him anyway. Many of the Nintendo-era Final Fantasy games, especially the original 3, were constrained by the technology of their time, with hard limits on how many colors a single sprite can utilize, what kind of animation sprites can have, and how many letters can fit in a text window. There's only so much you can do. Firion did not have much personality or story arc, and his appearance was defined by a few small sprites and his Yoshitaka Amano concept art. And if you had the Game Boy Advance version, the super deformed art they included in the manual. The explosive popularity of Final Fantasy VII had created a massive wave of new fans who experienced it as their first Final Fantasy, and it was what really established Final Fantasy as Square's flagship franchise. And for many of those newer fans, it shaped their views on what the franchise is about. The Nintendo-era games were accessible through PlayStation and Game Boy Advance ports, but in terms of mass public appeal, they couldn't compare to Final Fantasy VII. That is not to say that the new Sony-era fans ignored the older titles, absolutely not, but it is a fact that there was a rift starting at 7. It was the definitive Final Fantasy title, in the eyes of fans and in the eyes of pop culture. What had come before, good or not, was nowhere near as popular or well known. That is, until Dissidia leveled the playing field. Suddenly characters like Firion were here in full 3D, with distinct appearances, signature weapons, their own fighting styles, and defined personalities. The Nintendo-era characters weren't just here, either. They were treated as equals to more famous characters like Cloud and Squall. The story gave them just as much importance as anyone else. They were just as skilled in combat, and they fought together as comrades in arms. Several of them heralded from games where unique abilities, and particularly limit breaks, didn't exist. Dissidia created such things for them, and they were just as flashy and dynamic as the limit breaks we had seen in later titles. Add in voice acting, a first for a majority of the game's cast, and the characters were more alive than they had ever been before. Further, Dissidia did not just represent their characters, but their games as a whole. Each chapter explored story elements that at least had a thematic resonance with the original games, if not entirely lifting plot points from them. Terra being unable to control her powers and Kefka taking over her mind, Cecil being torn over trusting his brother who was actually manipulating him, Firion fighting to create a peaceful world free from the tyranny of the Emperor. They all took their inspiration from the original titles. As one example, the entire story of Tidus and Jecht is taken from Final Fantasy X. Tidus says he hates Jecht and wants to fight him and shut him up, but deep down he just wants his father to be proud of him. Tidus narrates his own chapter as though he's telling the story to someone else. His mid-story boss is a soft-spoken sorcerer wielding a staff, who is secretly manipulating and scheming to steal power from Jecht. And Jecht was once a hero that was turned to evil and lost his memories. Tidus's board icons are covered in swirls reminiscent of Yevon's script, and the summon stone he finds is the Magus Sisters. Tidus's attacks rely on him dodging and counterattacking, the abilities of the Cladboggle, and his HP attacks are his overdrives and quick hit, while Jecht's attacks are his attacks when fought as Braska's final Aeon. And the two fight in Dream's End, with a gigantic version of Jecht's sword stuck in the central platform. In short, Tidus's chapter immerses the player in Final Fantasy X iconography, and it is like this throughout the game. Characters strike iconic poses, quote memorable lines, and recreate familiar scenes. Even the animations are drawn from how the characters moved in their original games and how attacks looked in them. There's also a ton of in-jokes and winks to the fanbase, from Kefka calling Kuja a spoony bard, to Tidus and Jecht alluding to Taru Taru punting with Shantaro. Dissidia was truly a celebration of the entire Final Fantasy franchise, drawing on all that had come before and blending it together to create something simultaneously new and familiar. The staff clearly had a deep knowledge and love of the series and integrated pieces of it everywhere they could, weaving it into the very fabric of what Dissidia was. According to an interview with Ichiro Hazama, project manager for Dissidia, who was involved in many prior titles, the most popular Final Fantasy games among young fans in Japan in 2013 were Type 0 and Dissidia. For many worldwide, Dissidia was their first exposure to the games they hadn't played yet. For some it was their first Final Fantasy game ever, and they loved it. Fans may have picked up Dissidia just to act out Cloud vs Squall fights, or to beat up Titus using Sephiroth, and they left having fallen in love with unfamiliar characters they had never been interested in before. And this was the perfect time for someone to get into the series. The older games had been remastered and ported to modern consoles, and the PlayStation Store would soon carry the PS1 titles. It is doubtful that it was a purposeful marketing decision to release Dissidia at this time, when numerous past Final Fantasy games were being made more accessible to new audiences. But even so, the effect was clear. Final Fantasy VII had introduced a new generation of gamers to the franchise, and now Dissidia had done the same 10 years later. Except Dissidia did not introduce them to just a Final Fantasy game. It was a gateway to all of them. It got gamers playing those other titles to see more of the characters they had become fans of, to learn the full story of things that Dissidia had only alluded to. And it was this new generation of fans, and Square Enix recognizing the potential to be tapped with their response to Dissidia, that made it into the most influential game of the franchise, even more than Final Fantasy VII. The Battle of 1000 Hoqlizz is considered a highlight of gameplay and story in Kingdom Hearts 2, and it's easy to see why. It has multiple major plot advancements, an infamously difficult boss fight, a gauntlet of enemies where you fought alongside Final Fantasy characters, and Sora single-handedly destroyed 1000 Hoqlizz. In the midst of this is a scene of Cloud and Squall standing back to back, bantering as they prepare to face off with a swarm of enemies. The Battle of 1000 Hoqlizz was a very memorable sequence, and a major reason why was the reason Dissidia became such an influential game. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Aside from Kingdom Hearts, multiple Final Fantasy characters appeared in the Fortune Street series, and once again there was Airgaze. But this highlights that whenever a Final Fantasy character appeared as a cameo in another title, it was most likely going to be someone from 7, possibly 8 or 10, with 9 as a distant 4th option. Setsu's cameo in Kingdom Hearts 2 was so surprising because he was from an older game. Further, these cameos only happened in other franchises. Cloud's and Aerith's appearance in Tactics is one of a handful of times a Final Fantasy character directly crossed over into another game, and it was always on a small scale like this, just 1 or 2 characters in minor roles, or hints and teasing that a character had somehow traveled between worlds. But for Dissidia, its very premise was a big crossover of multiple games, and it embraced that idea. After Dissidia came out in 2008 and Dissidia Duodecim came out in 2011, the mobile game Kingdom Hearts Mobile included avatars based on the cast's Dissidia designs, and in 2012 we got Theatrhythm Final Fantasy reusing those designs and Dissidia's premise of a war between Cosmos and Chaos. Over the next few years we got Final Fantasy Airborne Brigade, which also reused this art style, and Pictologica Final Fantasy, which did not reuse the art style of Theatrhythm but had new art inspired by it. We also got games like Brave Exvius, Explorers, Mobius, and Dimensions 2, which told their own stories and had their own cast of characters, but they allowed players to call characters from other Final Fantasy titles into battle like summons, or to fight enemies from other games. After an abysmal response to All the Bravest in 2013, the next year Final Fantasy Record Keeper released to a more positive reception, and is now in its 6th year with over 200 characters and a very active player base. While Dissidia NT was not a huge success, its tie-in mobile game Opera Omnia has outlived it and continued to grow, and not only has a much larger roster than would be feasible for a home console Dissidia, but has a full story mode with ongoing plotlines. In 2016 there came World of Final Fantasy, a home console title with characters from across the franchise, and not just the headliners expected in a title like Dissidia. Less publicized characters like Refia, Quistis, and Aiko feature in the game. Record Keeper and World of Final Fantasy even managed to fit in some Kingdom Hearts cameos. To borrow a phrase from a certain other popular crossover fighting game, everyone is here. A content warning, this section of the video concerns the end of patch 5.3 in Final Fantasy XIV. Skip to this timestamp to avoid spoilers. At the end of the 5.3 storyline in Final Fantasy XIV's expansion Shadowbringers, Elidibus transforms into the original Warrior of Light to battle the player character, who has taken on the title of the Warrior of Darkness. The form he appears in is a more detailed, ornate take on the Dissidia Warrior of Light. In another era, say Final Fantasy XI around 2006, this would just be seen as a neat reference to an old piece of concept art that some fans may not even recognize. But because of Dissidia and all the crossovers since, the Warrior of Light has become so deeply ingrained in the franchise's mythos that his visage is instantly recognizable, so players understand the significance of Elidibus taking on his appearance. When he becomes the original Warrior of Light, he looks like the original Warrior of Light. It's a similar effect as with terminology like Ultima Weapon and Shinru. It's something that resonates with players because the words, and the ideas and imagery they evoke, have weight to them. They have a legacy within the franchise. They're important and meaningful just by virtue of being. It's something that Final Fantasy VII, and to a lesser extent 8 and 10, have always had. It's why the appearance of Cloud and Squall together was so impactful. And now, Dissidia had given that power to every game. The Wild Rose being associated with ideas of freedom and rebellion, a warrior changing jobs to combine light and darkness, a never-ending cycle of conflict fought between deities. These are ideas that had their foundations in the original games, but through Dissidia they permeated through the fandom and the franchise and took deeper root. It's why Elidibus transforming into the Warrior of Light has a similar effect on players now as seeing Sephiroth in Kingdom Hearts 20 years ago. Dissidia changed the game on what the franchise was, and how characters existed in it. It is comparable to the Avengers, in how it took different pre-established characters and brought them together for the first time, united against a Thanos-type threat beyond anything faced before. With a scope reaching across 20 years, from the first game to the latest game, it was almost as though the entire franchise had been building up to Dissidia, the ultimate showdown between all the heroes and all the villains to decide the fate of the multiverse. With Dissidia, Final Fantasy wasn't a franchise anymore, it was a universe. Now there are crossover titles everywhere, and not just one hero and one villain from each title, multitudes of characters who may not have even been prominent in their home titles, or even playable. Final Fantasy characters can meet up, adventure together, face off in battle, or just stand around and chat. When the cast of Dissidia appears, they will probably be using a design based on Dissidia, and their characterization and fighting style will be rooted in Dissidia. Characters who weren't in Dissidia are getting the same treatment with recurring attacks, signature weapons, and refined looks and personalities. On the other hand, some games don't look to Dissidia when designing returning characters. They look at the original game and use it to create new iconography for them. In both cases, there is the potential for future games to build on what others have established and not just copy Dissidia again. Dissidia threw open the floodgates to a deluge of crossover content, and there was no closing them. We live in an era where you don't need to replay your favorite game to experience its characters and stories again. We can have other games, many of which are just as fun and engaging as the main series, where we can witness familiar arcs play out in a new setting with new influences driving things, see characters get involved in new storylines and meet new comrades, and explore story and character ideas that the original games never could have done. In a way, Dissidia is practically a subgenre of the franchise now. A subgenre where Celes and Cloud can prepare to put on an opera together, where Ignis can cook lunch for Sabin and Zack and Prish, where you can form a party of Cids to fight another Cid, have Yuna team up with Garnet and Rydia to fight Seymour. A subgenre where the sight of Cloud and Squall together isn't as exciting as it was in 2006. Now, we're wondering if Cecil and Lightning are going to drop in to help them. It's a subgenre that allows for endless potential for storytelling beyond what a single main series Final Fantasy game could accomplish alone, and these games will only get deeper, richer, and better as the development teams become more ambitious and their fan bases keep growing. And it all began with Dissidia, a game that didn't have A-list celebrity voice actors promoting it, didn't get a release on a home console, and didn't have the sales numbers of the games that were coming out alongside it. But it left a legacy unlike any game before. and so far unrivaled by any game since. It's the game that transformed the franchise.